Yakuza Kiwami on the Switch! Wow, how crazy. That means it's the first game in this series to both appear on Nintendo hardware and be available on a portable device not connected to some sort of library with wider availability like the Steam Deck or PlayStation Portable, right? Well, for us in the West, yes, it's all very true, but over in Japan, that's not the case at all. The Yakuza or Like a Dragon series has actually quite an interesting history on portable platforms as well as Nintendo platforms. Throughout this video, I'll be having a look at those things, but to start off, I'll talk about the most relevant game of them all, Kiwami on the Switch. This is without any sort of doubt the very first game in this series to be on the Nintendo Switch. It's been nearly 80 years since the Switch released and has sold a gajillion billion units, and yet somehow it took Sega this long to finally put one of their RPG games on here. I'm not Digital Foundry, and Kiwami's an old-ass game at this point, so I'm not going to give you some proper review of this thing. But what I will say is that Kiwami is a remake of the first Yakuza game, but by remake, I mean it has the same story that copies all of the dialogue and animation data from the original PS2 version's cutscenes, but everything else is either new, like how the game has a new Japanese dub from the original Japanese dub, or is copied from a prequel that came out the year prior to Kiwami, known as Yakuza 0. Kiwami is a game that I've always said exists purely to be played after Yakuza 0. Pretty much every new bit of side content references 0, additional main story content portrays some of the characters the exact same way 0 does. The protagonist's 4 fighting styles are copied from 0, and to that last point, the game doesn't even give you a proper tutorial on how to use the styles because it assumes you've played Yakuza 0. And for a while now, for some weird reason, Sega have been trying to pretend like Yakuza Kiwami is the perfect starting point. Experience the series origin that's not even the origin in any context anymore. It's all a little strange, but then I sat down and thought about it for a minute. Lots of people can already assume that Sega pushing the hell out of Yakuza Kiwami and not 0 is to promote the upcoming Amazon Like a Dragon show. It's clearly supposed to be the first game's story, hence why Nishiki's the bad guy and Kiryu's the only good guy. But the Amazon show seems to be making a lot of changes to the original game's story and ignoring the events of Yakuza 0 and perhaps Yakuza 4. So in all honesty, the show and Kiwami are only really connected in premise alone. But Kiwami on the Switch is very obviously a test to gauge interest amongst a whole new massive audience of Nintendo Switch users. The release date is obviously to hype up the show and the game a bit more by promoting both, but you'd sort of think that Yakuza 0, which is a way more popular game and is earlier in the story, would make more sense as a first entry onto the Switch, right? Well, on a technical level, 0 and Kiwami are identical, but Kiwami is a significantly smaller game, and compared to porting something like the original PS2 game, which has never been ported to modern platforms, Kiwami would probably be a much simpler job to do. They can reasonably mark down the price of Kiwami much more than they can their other games, and if it doesn't end up selling very well, who cares? It's just Yakuza Kiwami. So 0 would have sold a lot more copies, but Kiwami is definitely a much safer choice to analyze the potential performance of the series on the Nintendo Switch. Hello, present day me here in a different room, so if audio sounds slightly different, that's why. Speaking of performance, it's time to talk about the performance of this game. In my opinion, the first and most important thing to mention is the frame rate. Resolution and graphical quality mean nothing if you might as well be playing a PowerPoint presentation. The game runs at what I can't exactly confidently say is 30 FPS. The frames drop randomly, particularly when it rains at the start of the game, although fortunately there's only like 2 parts of the game when it does rain. But the menus are at least in 60 FPS. Games can indeed swap between locked frame rates on the fly, but part of me sort of thinks that maybe it might be actually capped at 60. But it just obviously can't get up to there. So perhaps with the Switch 2, if it has backwards compatibility, that it might just naturally be at a higher frame rate on that thing. But for now, it's quite laggy. On the graphical side, anti-aliasing doesn't seem to be on any smooth settings. Texture resolution's fine, and level of detail scaling is fairly low. Besides all that though, it really is just the typical frame rate and graphical quality of a lot of Switch games made by studios that aren't related to Nintendo. Load times aren't SSD fast, but they're alright. Fortunately, saving is pretty quick and you can still save anywhere. Not sure if there's a maximum number of saves though, and if there is, what it is. The game also seems to have not fixed any bugs, or if it did, they at least didn't fix the max crush bug where you do a charge attack and your next hit action does 20 billion damage, thankfully. In terms of what's different about this game, it doesn't seem like there's really anything besides one feature that I believe was available in other versions. Because they've brought back the licensed music that had to get cut from the original international release, there's now a song called Bleed, which plays in one of the cutscenes, and it also plays in this alternate really boring intro for the game. So that feature I mentioned earlier is that you can swap between the Bleed intro or the Receive You Reborn intro, which was basically the same as the English one, but it had some slight edits and a different song. Like with some of the newer games and the Steam versions of some of the other games, you can choose your text language between English, Japanese, Korean, and Chinese just in the settings menu. Besides that though, the game controls nicely in docked or undocked. I know some people don't like Joy-Cons, but I really don't mind using them, especially for a game like this where there aren't any complex inputs. The Switch Pro controller, however,
however, is very good, which is why it's a good thing that this isn't the first game you can use it on, as you can indeed play the games on PC with one. While the Switch has stuff like 51 worldwide games that basically lets you play some of the mini games you can play in Kiwami already, the Switch needed something like Kiwami on it, as these games are truly perfect fits for portable consoles. And what's more, unlike 51 worldwide games, when you get bored of the mini games, you can just instantly go back to Kiwami. So hell yeah. I honestly believe a lot of people won't mind the frame rate. I mean, in particular Switch users. We're all so used to shit like Pokemon Scarlet and Violet by now that we just kind of expect it. But as someone who spent years playing Yakuza Kiwami at a high frame rate on my computer, I would have really liked better optimization, because I genuinely believe they could have at least added an option to target 60 FPS even if the game looked a bit poopy. But at least it's only $20 or 30 down here in Australia, and my beloved Nintendo Switch gets another really cool game to add to its library of epicness. Anyway, take it away, past me. Now, one thing to consider is that Kiwami is on Steam, which means you can play it on the Steam Deck. And as you may have noticed, not only have RGG Studio tried very hard recently to make sure their games are playable on the Steam Deck, but there have been many people online talking about how much they've loved playing whichever Yakuza game or games on their Steam Deck. Before I say anything else, this isn't at all me trying to say the Switch is better than the Steam Deck or the other way around. Steam Deck is a much more powerful console than the 2017 machine that's barely changed since then. However, there are a few problems with the Steam Deck. For one, although it's a very minor one that can easily be fixed, the weird aspect ratio of the deck screen means that you'll have the stupid bars at the top and bottom of the screen, unless you change the resolution to something where it's a bit zoomed in. But with those, I highly encourage every Steam Deck player to get an ultra-wide mod if you can, because the games all look much better without those very small bars there. But onto the more pressing matters. The Steam Deck was only purchasable in Australia as of this month, which for future viewers is October 2024. The only way you could actually get one in here was to get it from another country, and this is still likely the case for some other countries. Of course, this isn't really a problem for us Aussies anymore, but the deck will only be available in November, and I wouldn't be surprised if it takes like 40 years to ship here still. But more to the point, there's the price of a Nintendo Switch versus a Steam Deck. Now, this is all in Australian dollars, one, because I live here, and two, so I can show you how fucked the prices are. Of course, secondhand prices are always a different story, but most retailers will sell you a Switch OLED, the best model by an enormous landslide, for $539. There's even an upcoming bundle at the same price that includes Super Mario Bros. Wonder and 12 months of Nintendo Switch Online. Pretty nice deal. Then there's the standard Switch for $469, or you could do something that I cannot in good faith ever possibly recommend, which is to get a Switch Lite for $329 or $339 if you get the new Hyrule Edition. Now again, all of these are less powerful than any Steam Deck, but the cheapest Steam Deck is the 256GB LCD one for $649, which is $110 more than a Switch OLED. If you don't want to pay more, the LCD model is still a good choice, but to be honest, the additional money spent on the 512GB OLED model is definitely a much better decision. And then there's the last one, the 1TB OLED model. That's a bit overkill, which is priced at $1,049. So if we're being reasonable, you're spending $899 in Australia for the best Steam Deck model, which is $360 more than a Switch OLED. For the price of a Switch OLED and a Switch Lite, you could get a good Steam Deck. Now, just to be absolutely positively clear, this isn't to slander the Steam Deck. The prices are definitely much more than this Switch, but they are kind of justified. My brother even imported one earlier this year and has done nothing but praise it. To be quite honest, I saw one once secondhand in a used game store for a good price, and because of his praises, even I considered getting one, but I already own a good PC that I can play all the Yakuza games on at a beautifully high resolution and frame rate, and now I could very easily play specifically Yakuza Kiwami on my Nintendo Switch if I wanted, which I've owned since the day it came out back in 2017, the same day as my birthday, hell yeah, and I've had no problems with it whatsoever. Although, to be honest, I try my hardest to play Yakuza Kiwami as little as possible. Anyway, for the price of a 512GB OLED Steam Deck, an Aussie like me could get a Switch OLED, Yakuza Kiwami, and a selection of many other bloody awesome games like Metroid Dread and Metroid Prime, the Xenoblade games, Pokemon, Super Mario Odyssey, or Wonder if you grab that bundle, Fire Emblem, Breath of the Wild, and Tears of the Goddamn Kingdom, and plenty of super fun multiplayer games too, like Smash Bros. Or Mario Kart. Even with Nintendo's refusal to ever adjust prices of older shit games, it's all still a lot cheaper. But the benefit of a Steam Deck is obviously that a lot of people already have a Steam library, and of course Steam is a platform where every game goes on sale for 100% off every 10 minutes, so it all really depends on what you have and what you want. If you want some awesome exclusives, the Switch is worth. If you want to play SMT5 and not have it run at a negative frame rate, then any of the Yakuza games are perfect to play on the go
on the Steam Deck. And that's also not to mention the ROG Ally, which sucks. And speaking of perfect games to play on the go, we'll go back in time to the first appearance RGG made on portable hardware. These two games are only really known amongst the more dedicated members of the community, as they realistically are the most obscure games in the franchise, as in proper games, not gacha games, because those are scams, not video games. Anyway, I just shortened them to Kuroyo 1 and 2, but their full titles are something or other, Japanese thingy, whatever. These two games were exclusively released on the PSP, which stands for PlayStation Portable if you didn't know, and they were both exclusively released in Japan. Now, Japan exclusive sometimes means it was also released in like South Korea or China or some other Asian country, but as you can tell by the very Japanese name of the game, it was at least never released in any English-speaking countries. These two are easily the most unique of all of the other games, but at the same time have many iconic aspects that keep them in line with those games. For example, they're both still set in Kamurocho, with the second game also allowing you to explore Sotenbori. Both games let you use bikes or signs or various objects on the ground as weapons, and both games still have the iconic heat actions, some of which are copied from the mainline games, but a lot of which are completely original. The games both also have original stories, with a 17-year-old protagonist in the first, and then he becomes 19 in the second, compared to the way too old for this shit type of men you usually play as. Story was apparently done by RGG, and I can only assume the soundtrack was too, as it has the likes of Hidenori Shoji and new people like Heidelunge and Zenta, who eventually became core composers for the series. However, the gameplay was all clearly built off of a game series called Def Jam, and that's because the game part of this game was handled by the developers of that series, Sin Sophia. It's not exactly like this, but the game basically plays like a 3D fighting game like the Tekken series, as opposed to the usual 3D beat 'em up that we're used to. Every enemy in the game can also use the exact same stuff as you, such as all of your fighting styles, attacks, counters, and even heat actions. This unique aspect means that the game is already perfectly balanced for PvP. Yes, that's right, PvP in a Yakuza game. Unfortunately, I have no idea how to set up this multiplayer, as I am the only one I know both with the game and with a PSP, and I'm not sure how to do it on an emulator or anything. But it is indeed a thing. If you want to know more specific things about these two games, like the differences between each other or the differences between them and the main series, or maybe the pros and cons of each game, I have 2 videos dedicated to just them. These two games were truly brilliant though. Having such a fun game that you could fit into your pocket with endless hours of side content to mess around with, just like the main games, or main story to sink your teeth into, it's incredibly upsetting that it never got localized. The PSP was super popular, I assume. I mean, as a kid during the PSP's life, I saw like 10 of them, compared to the 800,000 Game Boys or DS's I saw, or that I myself played on. Anyway, it was popular, and with Kuroyo 1 and 2 being as awesome as they are, it was a huge shame that at that time especially, the Yakuza series was scraping its own face very hard on the pavement in the West. These two games have been given the love they deserve in more recent times, with both of them getting fan-made English patches allowing more English fans to have an easier time playing them. But unfortunately, given their circumstances, there's still not really any mainstream knowledge of them. A lot of the time, remasters of old games just basically put up the resolution or something and then slap it on modern platforms with none of the original issues being addressed, and in many cases, various other issues end up showing up as well. But of all games in this series, these two are the most deserving of just a simple remaster like 3, 4, and 5 had, as there really is nothing else like them, so you won't feel like they're inferior to other games in the series. If it never happens, I'm not going to scream at Sega or anything, but it would be poetic if they can come back with a portable vengeance on the Switch. But while we're on the topic of remasters, it's time to talk about the first remasters of this series. These remasters were of Yakuza 1 and 2, as in the original PS2 versions. No, I don't mean Kiwami 1 and 2, but instead I mean Yakuza 1 and 2 HD. It was a Japan exclusive collection available on the PS3 and the Wii U, making this the first game in this series to have appeared on Nintendo hardware, and up until Kiwami, it was the only one. Before I go into detail about the Wii U aspect of this collection, the HD in the title of this game is incredibly appropriate. I really cannot tell you of any visual improvements to the game beyond a better resolution. I own a Wii U, and I also own the PS3 version of this very collection, but I've never played it on my PS3 because my PS3 sucks and it never wants to work when I want it to, and I've never touched the Wii U version at all. Now, real quick, to the stupid dumb fuck Americans that think that America is the only country in the world, believe it or not, emulating video games, even if you own everything you need to play them legally, is completely 100% illegal in Australia. It's a bullshit rule, but it is indeed a rule. So, Australian police, I know some US citizens who have played it on an emulator, and it all looks and runs perfectly fine, minus the text glitching out a bit every now and then. It's not me that's played it, definitely not me. I'm a good boy who only plays real hardware that I tamed using legal tender. But anyway, in terms of more mechanical differences, I don't think they changed anything, or at least not noticeably anything, besides the fact that you can control the camera using the right stick in both games. In the PS2 versions, the camera just sort of spins around on its own with the sole purpose of pissing you off, but at least you can reset it behind you to sort of control it, but you can't lock it in place or anything like a Zelda game, so it will just keep on spinning. So the HD version, despite doing dick all, is a massive improvement over the PS2 games and is honestly just the way to play the game. But of course, as it was only released in Japan, it was only ever in Japanese, which sort of ruins that idea. I think though there's a mod someone did to just sort of port over the English text into these versions, but I don't remember. Anyway, on to the Wii U part of this section. RGG Studio aren't at all opposed to the idea of making games for Nintendo platforms, considering that their Super Monkey Ball series has been fairly synonymous with Nintendo, as well as the one time the team made an F-Zero game on the GameCube called F-Zero GX. So then, why was there only ever one single game on Nintendo hardware? Well, obviously you could point to the fact that Nintendo is a very kid-friendly company and they don't ever have mature games on their platforms, and if you said that, you'd be wrong and you'd be stupid. Nintendo's had plenty of games meant for a more mature audience. Just look at a game series like Metroid or Fire Emblem, and for more specific entries, stuff like Resident Evil 4 was a GameCube exclusive, and these days the Switch has stuff like The Witcher 3, Doom 2016, and Doom Eternal, just to name a couple. You also could probably argue that the graphical quality of the games requires more powerful hardware, hence why they've been basically PlayStation exclusives up until recently, but again, you'd probably be wrong. They are all beautiful games in their own way, but they've never utilized the full potential of the consoles their games have been released on, to put it kindly. And what's more, games like Xenoblade X were on the Wii U with its enormous open world, and these days on the Switch you have Metroid Prime Remastered, which sometimes just casually looks like a PS6 game. So the Wii U likely could have still handled something like Yakuza 3, even if they had to compromise things here and there. But with their experience with Nintendo in the past, and the fact that their games are still perfect fits for Nintendo consoles, I guess they thought to test the waters with 1 and 2 HD on the Wii U. However, because it was the fucking Wii U, which sold like 12 units, and because it was a collection of 2 old games and not the new hotness, that was also available on the superior and more popular PS3, 1 and 2 HD on the Wii U didn't exactly break records. So even if it wasn't the only factor, it definitely played a part in RGG losing hope for their RGG games on Nintendo consoles. Cut to now though, and clearly the Switch port of Kiwami is serving the same purpose of sussing things out as 1 and 2 HD on the Wii U did. But Sega, if you're listening, regardless of how well Kiwami does on the Switch, do not lose hope. The Switch 2 is just around the corner, and chucking more games onto the Switch is the perfect opportunity to expand the audience more than a game on the Wii U ever could. Just saying. And now that that's done, it's time to head back to portable PlayStations and talk about the presence of the Yakuza games on the PS Vita, the iconic handheld device that wasn't the 3DS. The Vita had about 2 games on it that weren't games ported from other consoles or that eventually made their way to other consoles. So rather appropriately, the 2 Yakuza games on the Vita were 2 games available on the PS3 and PS4. However, they're not full games and instead are 2 companion apps for the original Like a Dragon Ishin and Yakuza 0. These were, unsurprisingly, also only available in Japan, which makes sense given the original Ishin and the PS3 version of Yakuza 0's Japanese exclusivity in the first place. The point of these 2 apps was that they were essentially demos of Ishin and 0, but also that they could act as somewhat portable versions of the side content of the 2 games. In all honesty, I have no idea if they were free or not, or if you had to buy 0 Ishin first because I obtained them illegally. I bought them. Yes. I'll start with the first one they made. Now, I have no idea how to record stuff from my Vita without just pointing my phone at it, so excuse the shoddy quality of the footage and the horrible gameplay, as not only did my phone just completely block my view, it also refused to ever focus on anything. When you launch both of these apps, they start with basically a story setup for their respective game, again, because they were supposed to be like demos. From the main menu, at the bottom you can see there's a sync option, which I'll discuss in a bit, a store to buy some very basic items, and the settings, which has nothing special. The bottom right also displays things like your level, your money, and your playtime. Whoa, look at that high level in all those hours. On a companion app? What are you, a loser? I hear you saying. Well, yes, but it's actually because that sync option is for syncing your save file between this app and the actual game itself. So I synced up my save file from the PS4 version, and to be honest, I'm incredibly surprised it's still a thing you can do because you don't just locally sync the 2 games, but instead have to upload the save file from one version and download it on the other. But why even do that? What the hell is the point? Well, starting from the left is the Second Life minigame, which some of you likely have done a fair bit of in the remake. This little thing here takes you to the full minigame. Everything's here, including your crops that take some time to grow. So, because I've synced my save file, I have the option to stuff around in this minigame, say on the train, in my bed before I go to sleep, whenever I want really. Whatever the situation, you can do it portably with this app. The downside is that because you have to constantly re-upload and re-download your save files between devices, it's not like passing a game over from your Steam Deck to your PC, but if you were going on like a weekend trip and wanted to work towards your Ishin Platinum or had nothing better to do, this was one way to do it. From this little house, you can head out to the blacksmith and access the full thing. You can go fishing to some spots that I honestly don't remember being in the main game, but perhaps I just forgot. Or you can do the significantly more entertaining thing, leaving. In the middle, there's Ishin's battle dungeon. As in, the entire thing. Every single dungeon, every single trooper card, and every single fighting style, weapon, ability, you name it, is all available here. There are some strange differences though, mostly with evade strikes for some reason. They're not as spammable as they're supposed to be in the full game, and for some reason enemies are invincible after throwing them for a tiny bit longer than they should be. There's probably more, but those are some things that immediately stuck out to me because the evade strikes in the original Ishin were bullshit. I think these small differences may have been due to the frame rate though. Ishin on PS4 runs at a very smooth 60 FPS, but as can be seen from the footage, on the Vita it runs brilliantly. Well, when I say brilliant, bro, oh my god. It also controls quite poorly too, but that's just thanks to the kind of weird controller of the Vita, with its not very good analog sticks and the fact that pressing L2 and R2 is really hard to do because of these stupid back touchpad things. Maybe it's just my secondhand Vita that's shit, but I don't know, trying not to use heat actions is pretty impossible. Although for probably the only touchscreen functionality, you can activate trooper cards with the touchscreen. But then there's nothing else to say about the battle dungeon. It's just Ishin's battle dungeon, exactly the same in the full game and only slightly different in the remake. So that leaves the last thing available to us. On the right side is a selection of tabletop games that you can usually find in the Yakuza games. There's Mahjong, Koi Koi, Oichikabu, Poker, and Shogi. Just like with Second Life, you can play some minigames here and gain some tokens that you can use to buy stuff in the game like the sweet-ass golden pistol. And this exact mode is in the main game, with the only difference being that you can't play solo in the main version. Now here's the interesting thing. It's not local multiplayer because you can't do split screen with something like Poker, and that's because this mode has actual online multiplayer, like with matchmaking and everything. That's actually crazy. This is, as far as I'm aware, the only actual online multiplayer in any of these games, unless you could do it in Kuroyo, but I don't know. And it's all unfortunately wasted on a companion app and a menu option in one game. How bizarre. Obviously I'm not going to find anyone, but when you hit search, it seems to look for 30 seconds and go, nope, there's no one, and stops the search. I'm not sure if it does that because the servers are off, but I tried searching on both my Vita and my PS5 at the same time and it didn't do anything, but that could also be because it's the same PSN account searching on both devices. But now we move on to the second companion app. This is pretty much identical to the Ishin one, but of course it's Yakuza 0 instead of Ishin. This means that you get to play as Kiryu Majima, and you can once again sync your save files, but not only do I not own Yakuza 0 on PS3 or PS4, but I believe only the Japanese version of the game has the sync option in the menu anyway. Regardless, I'm being reminded of how dogshit Yakuza 0 is without any abilities because I have no save file. Anyway, some differences between the two apps is that, although the Yakuza 0 one still has an online leaderboard for whatever things, it doesn't have online multiplayer. The gambling minigames are also slightly different. Kiryu has access to Koi Koi, Oichikabu, Chohan, and CeeLo Green, then Majima has poker, blackjack, baccarat, and roulette, which means there's no shogi or mahjong. In the bottom left, there's some Sega games that apparently you can play, but it takes you to the PlayStation Store, so I genuinely don't know if these are just basically ads for some other games. For example, the top right one is some Super Monkey Ball thing, but I believe because I don't have access to the Japanese PlayStation Store, I can't look at any of these. In the bottom right, there's a shop you can buy and sell stuff at, but basically everything you can buy is absurdly weak, like how the gun there does negative damage. You practically heal the enemy with this thing. But you can fecklessly use these weapons in the top left option, the bed of sticks, which is Yakuza 0's arena. I believe that this is just the full arena from 0, which would also mean that if you have a save file, you gain access to everything that 0's combat has to offer. If there's any subtle differences like the Ishin app, I wouldn't have a clue, because again, I have no upgrades and only Thug and Brawler. I'm not joking, I think default Majima and Kiryu and 0 are the absolute weakest you can possibly be in any of the Yakuza games. It would literally be quicker to kill the enemies with the lung cancer they get from Kiryu's secondhand smoke than actually trying to kill them. Back to the main menu, in the bottom middle, there's pachinko slots. Pachinko in any description sucks. Japan, get any freaking pastime for Christ's sake. Anyway, there's only one that's actually available because the other takes you to the PlayStation Store, which again, either isn't available anymore or is only for Japanese accounts like with those Sega games. This is just another way to get some money, and I believe it isn't at all available in the main Yakuza 0 unless it's only in the Japanese version or something, but I don't think so. It's a strange addition, and honestly a pointless one. One last thing before I move on though, there are two cool little things that also aren't available in the main games. These are some songs that are exclusive to the Yakuza 0 companion app. They're available on the official soundtrack, so you may have heard them before, but they're the songs Interspace Garden and View the Ranking, both done by Yuri Fukuda. And that, my friends, is the comprehensive history of the Yakuza or Like a Dragon series on portable platforms, minus the gacha game. It's interesting to see them sort of avoid portability, but with the rise of the Switch and the availability of these games on Steam Deck, I think their mentality has changed. If you only own a Nintendo Switch and are interested in playing these games, definitely give Kiwami a go. Should it do well enough, I believe that eventually they'll put Zero on there, and maybe down the line more games can show up on the current Switch or even the next Switch. But if you enjoyed the video, then please subscribe. I'm very close to 50k, and the closer I get, the less my parents hate me and the more I'm willing to make more videos. So if you're perhaps interested in learning many interesting things that no one else gives enough of a fuck to cover, I am the one who will give you that fuck. But before the video ends, there's one last thing to say. And let me just stand up. The best game ever made is on PC! Buy Final Fantasy 16 right now!